Atëherë përshëndetje. Mund të fillojmë dhe webinarin e radhës, atë të fundit do të thosha, i cili është i mbyll serinë e gjithë webinareve që kemi realizuar gjatë korrikut. Gjithsesi do të kemi mundësi në konferencën finale përmbledhëse pas 2 ditësh të trajtojmë përsëri çështjet më të rëndësishme të cilat janë diskutuar gjatë tyre 11 sesioneve, si dhe të bëjmë një përmbledhje, një seri përfundimesh, mund të themi, nga gjithë këto webinare, gjithë këto speakerë të rëndësishëm që kemi pasur gjatë gjithë kohës. Sot, si që keni parë dhe nga agenda, kemi përsëri të ftuar si folëse kryesore Alexandra Voudouri, e cila do të në webinarin e sotëm do të diskutojmë mbi panoramën e medias në nivel europian, kryesisht nga këndvështrimi i Brukselit, se çfarë ndodh në Bruksel apo në çështjet europiane, dhe duke ditur që në çështjet janë shumë të komplikuara, ka shumë institucione, ka shumë fusha të cilat Bashkimi Europian e shtrin kompetencat apo dhe funksionet e tij, shpesh bëhet e vështirë dhe shumë teknike për t'u shpjeguar në publikun e gjerë, si në vendet anëtare, po ashtu dhe në vendet që synojnë antarësimin, që janë të interesuar sigurisht për të njohur, për të kuptuar më shumë nga ky proces. Cilët janë ato rrugët më të mira për të përcjellë informacionin, si e bën media këtë përcjellje informacioni, cilat janë specifikat dhe në këndvështrimin e zhvillimeve të fundit, qoftë pandemia, Covid, apo dhe ashtu quajtur fenomeni fake news. Për gjithë këto çështje do kemi mundësi të diskutojmë në pjesën e pyetjeve dhe diskutimeve, por tani kam kënaqësinë t'i kaloj fjalën Aleksandrës për prezantimin e saj.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being with us today. My name is Alexandra Voudouri. I'm a diplomatic affairs editor and analyst for European affairs for English News Service Macropolis and the Athens Municipality's radio station. I would like to thank the European movement in Albania and ELIAMEP in Athens for this opportunity to talk to you today about how we could better understand the European Union from the media perspective, and not only. One could ask, why is this important, especially when someone does not have a media-related job or public relations affiliated work with the European Union? I could say that simply because the European Union occupies a central position in the politics and the economic life of its 27 EU member states, and of course of its aspiring EU candidate countries, and an important role in the rest of the world. And the European Union public has never been more opinionated about the EU project as it is right now. Most importantly, I have noticed myself that it is not only the EU public, but also the public in the EU candidate countries, that it is so much engaged with the EU project. And in fact, there is a difference. The public in EU candidate countries seems more enthusiastic and even less critical about the EU project than the public in the European Union. So it is clearly important that citizens from the 27 EU member states, and those of course from the candidate countries, understand the effect the European Commission, the Parliament and the European Council have in their lives, what policies they discuss and approve, what relationship have with national governments, what assistance offer to EU and EU candidate member states, how much they pay to them, how much power they actually have, and what powers are seeking to have. So as you can imagine, the media are playing quite a decisive and rather defining role in this regard. And this is something that the European Union acknowledges and explains to a large extent its institutions' efforts to reach out the public and convey messages through the media. So we can clearly understand that this is an interactive relation, the one between the European Union institutions and the media. Thus, how the European Union is working and presenting itself to the world, and how institutions and the media are interacting to this end, it is not useful only for journalists, but I could say it is useful for the public and even researchers, even civil society members, or even academics. So today we will be focusing on this issue, how the European Union presents itself, and also we will be talking about the cost of communicating, and also who are the players in this communications strategy, what are the media sources, and how can anyone get the best value from EU spokespersons, EU officials, or databases. We will also be talking about how we could better understand the EU talk, and of course, the social media effect that has been the case for many years now, and especially in the last decade. And also we would examine the differences and the difficulties for journalists reporting from Brussels and reporting from Tirana. And I think this is more or less the same difficulties that people who are working for EU projects face when they are working outside Brussels. So, first of all, how the media, how the European Union presents itself. I will begin with the European Commission, and because there we have something. We have a daily briefing from the European Commission, where correspondents in Brussels gather every day in the press room at the European Commission's headquarters, the Berlaymont, to attend the briefing. There are press releases in the entrance which have to be communicated immediately by real-time media, that is radio, websites, TV, newswires, agencies. These press releases are most of the times written in technical style, most of the times with a quote of a commissioner, usually announcing that the news is good, the revealed problem is solved, regulation is being implemented, etc. Having said that, I have to note that usually the European Commission wants to convey positive messages. The spokespersons do not really talk about difficulties, confrontations, and the implementation, the difficulties of implementing regulations by EU member states. And this is a problem for the journalists. Usually, however, Wednesdays are more interesting days for correspondents, since the European Commission deals with infringement procedures against member states which have not applied, for instance, the EU law, or closed when governments comply. And this has been the case, especially during the debt crisis. I do remember the government in Athens always waiting to see what the spokesperson of the European Commission would say on Wednesdays about the outcome, for instance, of the assessment of the Troika, or the meeting the Troika, the so-called Troika, was having with members of the government when certain agreements needed to be implemented. So the difference is that in this case, the press releases are very carefully prepared so as to keep reporters busy for a couple of days or even days, for a couple of hours or even days. The briefing usually starts by the head spokesperson, who sets out the agenda of the day, and then deputy spokespersons take the floor for specific issues, details, etc. Questions are taken always, but sometimes are answered, sometimes are rebuffed by the spokespersons. Briefings last for an hour, attended by several journalists, while others watch it via streaming videos from their offices. Usually, they are preceded by technical briefings held off the record by officials to give background info on a regulation or a directive. At the end, reporters tend to gather around the commissioner, who happens to be there on that day, or his spokespersons, to ask additional questions to which the answers are usually off the record. And as you can understand, this exercise, which lasts almost half an hour, it is more interesting for reporters because than the actual briefing, because there the language is less formal and they can ask whatever they want, and they can approach more easily the commissioner and take more detailed answer to the issues that have surfaced during that day or that period. The European Commission often claims that it is the only institution in the world, apart from the US White House, that holds daily briefings allowing questions from reporters on a daily basis. This is true, and since this is happening, we can also see the midday briefing at the Berlaymont as an open forum. But how do reporters themselves assess the process? As usual, reporters are never totally satisfied with the info they are getting. Veteran correspondents like Libération Jean Quatremer claim that the press corner is useless and point out that some decades ago, the approach to the commissioners was much more easy, while now their spokespersons are usually shut in their offices and they are not easily approached. However, the truth is somewhere in the middle, because there are other correspondents, usually young and more enthusiastic, that they acknowledge that the briefings are useful in understanding the technicalities of an issue. But as you can imagine, the journalists usually think that the spokesperson give the info they want to give and leave unanswered questions that do not fit into the scheme. And probably this is a reality. Most journalists criticize the way the European Commission conveys its messages, as these are usually carefully articulated, as I have mentioned before, while they compare the off-the-record briefings with the ones by the European Council, which they find more interesting. They find it more interesting because there at the European Council, there are more spokespersons, and usually there are people, not usually, this is the normality, there are people coming from the national EU member states, and these off-the-record briefings take place just before the European Councils, and this allows the spokespersons to brief journalists on the actual problems, on the confrontations, which is more or less always the case before crucial EU councils. What are the difficulties that do not allow agreements? So journalists find the off-the-record briefings from the European Council much more interesting, and some say that there is an intra-institutional competition which at the end weakens the European Commission, because as I said, journalists find that important news usually come from the other side of the street, literally from the other side of the street, where there is the headquarters of the meetings of the European Council. At the same time, I have to add here that all people working as press officers or spokespersons at the European institutions have usually a particularly delicate task. They are expected to be open and full in the info they give, but often walk on a tightrope because they are being monitored by national governments. This has been the case mostly during the financial crisis. Every single word of any official press officer or spokesperson was market assessed. So this is the argument the spokesperson usually give when they are criticized for giving just a very well-prepared and articulated statements without using a more political tone in their statements. They look like they are talking more technically. They say that most of the times we have to be careful of what we say because, for instance, markets are watching and a wrong word could make more damage than good. On the other hand, national governments are easily responding with anger. This is also the case if a comment or recommendation clashes with their own narratives for their domestic audience and the measures being taken to implement regulations, etc. And this has certainly been the case during the financial crisis. And I do remember Greek governments responding very angrily when there was a specific recommendation by the European Commission that was not fitting in to the narrative that Greek governments were using for their domestic audiences. Another crucial part the spokesperson usually play is that of spinning news. And this is something that requires a very delicate performance. The spinning of the news is like an art because spokespersons, their job is not just to give info, but give the info that the institutions want to give and convey as a message through the media. And for that reason, most of the times, spokespersons are coming from the media section. So many journalists have been recruited for this job, and we will see later on the who is who, especially during this period in this communication strategy with the European Commission. Most spokespersons are former journalists. And in fact, spinning and public relations has become more influential during the last decades. In fact, some claim that journalists have lost actually the power of deciding what is more or less significant. Some even claim that journalists used to be gatekeepers and now this is actually gone. However, the truth is somewhere in the middle. On their behalf, I'm sure because I have experienced it by myself, reporters claim that spokespersons are more sensitive now than before and have become more crumby with negative news stories, accusing journalists of even being anti-EU. Usually the spokesperson or press officers are angry when they see a negative news story that is not giving a positive idea of a regulation that the European Commission gives importance to. But I think that being critical to a regulation doesn't make you anti-EU. Sometimes, on the contrary, I could say. And here is where the European Union and its institutions have acknowledged that people who are in these positions of spokesperson need to have more political criteria when they speak to the press. And one fine example of a very good spokesperson was the previous head spokesperson of the European Commission, the spokesperson of Jean-Claude Juncker, Mr. Margaritis Kinas, and I'm not mentioning him because he's Greek. He was not speaking as a technocrat, and the most important thing is that he was speaking always with a political criteria. Another problem that there is between journalists, media people, and in their relation with the EU institutions is lack of trust, and this has been declined in the past, especially during the debt crisis. Because some Brussels correspondents claim that they were usually misled by some EU institutions. And in fact, they are claiming that the European Union, the European Commission, excuse me, was not the center of decision-making, which is actually true, because during the debt crisis, other institutions were playing more vital role in decision-making. That is even the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, the ECB, the European Central Bank. And as we all know, final decisions were always taken at the level of the European Council instead of the European Commission. Now, communicating the European Union is not something that happens only in Brussels. As you can understand, a great deal is done on a national level. Now, taking a look, and I think it has its own interest, is the cost of communicating from the European Union. So to communicate its activities to over 446 million citizens from 27 EU member states in 24 languages, the European Commission earmarked 250 million euros in 2019. And I'm using 2019 budget because the agreement on this year's budget was only agreed just a few days ago, so we don't know how much money will go from this year's budget to the communication strategies. And from this money, 66 million go to salaries of officials. Additional 16 million euros are for the salaries for those tasked with press relations in the representation offices of the EU outside Brussels. However, that is only 0.2% of the whole EU budget, at least for 2019. Now, currently there are 40 spokespersons, official spokespersons for the European Commission. And when I say official spokespersons, I mean those who could speak in the name of the institution. And each one, I have to tell you that shares one or two assistants, while each commissioner has one person dealing with the press in his native country. Here it is really interesting to see who are the players in this communication strategy during these times and during this European Commission. First of all, the Directorate General for Communication is the Commission's department responsible for explaining EU policies to outside audiences. It keeps the Commission abreast of political developments and of trends in public opinion and the media. It also coordinates communication campaigns within the Commission. It's really easy to find who are these people that are working in the European Commissions or in the European Parliament's communication strategy. You can go to the Directorate General of the European Commission, and it's really easy to find the contacts. And for journalists who want to address or ask for instance interviews from the European Commission President or other spokesperson, they can go to the press contacts and the spokesperson service here. As you can see, in total, there are 88 people working as spokespersons at the European Commission currently. Eric Mammer is the chief spokesperson, that is, he talks on behalf of Ursula von der Leyen. And I remember very well a headline in Politico's website when there was a title saying that Ursula von der Leyen chose a French to speak in the name of her. There is a deputy chief spokesperson, Dana Spinan, who is from Romania and used to be a journalist covering Brussels for Romanian media. and also the head of unit, Elisabeta Dimitrova. Now, for my colleagues in Albania, there are two other spokespersons that I think they would be interesting to get access to ask interviews or to better understand the policies from now on regarding, for instance, the negotiating framework for Albania in its process now to begin accession talks with the EU. One is Peter Stano, who is the spokesperson for foreign affairs and security policy. That is, he's the spokesperson of Josep Borrell, who is the High Representative President, the head of the European Union's diplomacy, as we say. And there is also Anna Pisonero, who is a spokesperson for Oliver Varelli, the Neighborhood and Enlargement Commissioner. And as you can see here, it's really easy to understand the who is who and who is doing what. She is spokesperson for Oliver Varelli, and here we have a section of its expertise, that is neighborhood and enlargement. So having said the who is who, it is also interesting to talk about other communication means that the European Union is using. For instance, we have the European Union's TV information aimed at providing material from the European Parliament, the European Council, the European Central Bank. But mostly here, you can find the midday briefings. If a journalist is working, for instance, reporting for the EU from Tirana, can go to the audiovisual every day. The EBS Live gives the midday briefings, and of course, all the other activities of the institutions mentioned before. And we also have the Europarlament television. It has its own TV, which costs around 5 million euros per year. This is really useful tool not only for journalists, but also for researchers or academics who would like to listen again to some speeches given at the plenary, or more specifically at the committees. And you can see here the videos of the last plenary session. The European Commission President explained to the Deputies the decisions of the latest European Council that took place just a few days ago. Very briefly, the Parliament, the communication of the European Parliament is less easy to track, since each Eurodeputy has at least one person to deal with the press. The spokesperson's office, the spokesperson of the President of the European Parliament, of Mr. Sassoli, has 26 people plus a press officer for each member state and a representative in every capital. In total, 86 people are dealing with the communication of the European Parliament. The European Council has a slightly larger team, 100 people, including technicians, photographers, social media people, and 10 people monitoring the press. The total budget for the Council is much higher than the one of the European Commission, is around 550 million euros. Perhaps that might explain why sometimes the briefing at the European Council is much more interesting than the one of the European Commission. I'm just kidding. Now, taking a look at the media sources where someone can understand the EU talk. First of all, there are many levels of EU journalism. Many media are entirely dedicated to the European Union. These are transnational, I could say, media. That is the global media services, such as Reuters, Bloomberg, the global economic papers like the Financial Times and Economist, or the global broadcasters like Euronews or even BBC, even though the last couple of years, the BBC, especially after the Brexit referendum, when it talks about Europe, it doesn't really focus on the EU, but rather on European stories. For instance, for the last European Council, they didn't even have a correspondent there reporting live the decisions made by the European Council, because obviously they were not interested at a national level. These organizations, and I mean from Politico, which is an online service, EU Observer, Euractiv, I think you are most of you familiar with all these media. In contrast with national media covering the EU, see their mission and their business model as providing coverage which has little or no national focus. And most of the times, these media are a better tool, not only for what they produce, that is the news, but also for making the public understand better about the EU talk. For instance, Politico has every day a specific newsletter called Brussels play game, which is written by Florian Eder, and usually sets out the agenda, explains the agenda of that day, or of decisions being made, for instance, by the EU Council the previous day, and also explains new words, new terms, the jargon being used in Brussels, and it's not easily understood in the national capitals. For instance, during the latest European Council, just before that, we suddenly were hearing about the member states called frugals, which were no other than Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and which were against the 750 million euros that they were supposed to be given with no loans. So Politico and this kind of EU-based media try to explain to the public even the terms, but also they better explain the agenda being set in Brussels. Having said that, all the mentioned media are useful sources, not only for what they produce, that is the news, but also for making journalists and, more importantly, the public better understand difficult issues, as I said, and they provide usually in-depth analysis and interviews with high-ranking officials. Some media are also focusing on the Western Balkans as well, and more specifically, for instance, The Economist, apart from the column that is Charlemagne and it's dedicated to the EU, I think most of you happen to know Tim Judah, who's a veteran correspondent for the Western Balkans and has his own column called Espresso in The Economist, while the Financial Times have a specific correspondent covering the Western Balkans, and usually Valerie Hawkins is also relating her stories with the European hopes of these countries. I could also add Politico, which always pays attention to what is happening on the Western Balkans as well. It has its own correspondents in many capitals of the Western Balkans. Having said that, and going back to the talk about the EU and how to better understand the EU, we could be quite certain that the economic crisis has significantly changed the work of journalists working to cover the European Union. It has forced them to keep up with the pace of decision-making, which was highly technical and complex. They had to undergo, as you can imagine, a fast learning process and sometimes even expose their ignorance. Most journalists were not familiar with financial terms, and those who were could hardly understand, at least initially, the new debates, the new policies, the mechanisms which reached an uncommon degree of complexity. They also had to translate very complicated messages into simple words, given the most decisions were affecting their countries' of course, interests and the lives of their public. This unprecedented situation, however, had two very positive effects. Firstly, it has encouraged journalists to shift their focus from Brussels and Strasbourg to other cities in Europe, especially during the crisis, the financial crisis, for instance, in Athens or in Berlin, where decisions were actually being taken, or in Frankfurt, or even in Luxembourg, and also created a genuine and unprecedented interest among the public, looking for fresh and reliable news about taxes, austerity measures, welfare cuts. So, as you can imagine, viewers have become increasingly demanding, but also very skeptical as well. Now, in their efforts to clarify terms, jargon, the EU jargon, reporters are seeking explanations. And one of the sources that they're actually using to this end is Twitter. Twitter, especially during the financial crisis, has been one of the most useful tools for correspondents and reporters. Like everything on Twitter, it's all about finding the right people to follow. Ironically, the more difficult the issue, the more useful Twitter is. So if you find the right people, you have sources of rare expertise, and there is a lot of stuff there for free, as you all know. And there is quite a lot in this 140 words analysis. There are also threads there, or even links to related issues, detailed info that would have taken the journalists hours to find. So Twitter is one of the social media that they're being used. And I think not only from a journalist perspective, even the public could better understand some things easier using the social media, and more specifically Twitter. On the other hand, I have to mention that there is an ongoing increase in online journalism. Online journalism has become more successful through these years, even though the profit is really low. However, it targets specific groups and has become part of professional conversations. And the online journalism, in fact, has helped the interaction more between journalists and the public. Through online journalism, reporters can be in constant dialogue with readers and followers who are equally or more involved in the issues covered than the journalists themselves sometimes. Now, talking about the social media, on behalf of the European institutions, they have acknowledged since ever that they are very useful tools to convey their messages to the public. So the European institutions not only use the traditional media, but in the last couple of years, they have been using a lot the social media. And of course, we have the European Commission's official account, which is this one, the European Parliament, which is the most important thing is that the European Parliament has a Twitter account, and you can find everything in the 24 EU languages. And of course, the European Council has not only one official account, it has two, I think, and one of the most important accounts is the European Council one, at least for journalists more important, because it gives real-time updates of what is actually going on when a European Council is taking place. The official European Council account usually just tweets decisions being made by the European Council. So it seems that both the European institutions and journalists in Brussels tweet and blog. However, what is not assessed, or rather what is missing here, is an inter-exchange, even cooperation between the two. What certainly at early stages is the more active engagement of the public, even though most of the times the European Commission is asking, as you can see here, from the public to have a saying on important issues like, as it says here, the electronic identification and the cross-border transaction. It actually urges the public to join the consultation. And this is also another example. The European Commission is urging the public to have a saying on its portal, to revamp the portal regarding the European Union laws. So, taking a look now on the differences and the difficulties for reporters working in Brussels and for reporters working in the capitals of the EU member states or the aspiring EU candidate countries. First of all, I have to say that most news organizations, when reporting the European Union, produce coverage which is not aimed at Europeans. Actually, it's aimed at French, Dutch, Greeks, and other national citizens. The subject is always what is the European Union doing for and to us. Journalists who find themselves assigned to cover the European Union or Europe thus do what it's naturally. They bring the nation to them. Whether this is good or wrong, it's something that we could further discuss. More journalism for Brussels, our central institution, they deal with all eyes on the business of determining how far they act in or against the interests of the whole country. However, respondents actually are based in Brussels have the opportunity, as you can imagine.
Alexandra?
Yes.
Sorry, can you speak a little bit slower because we're having some problems with the internet. Okay. And
would you like me to repeat please the last paragraph, or would you like me to go on but in a slower pace?
Yes, also if you could repeat, because we had some noise during and the interpretation could not follow.
Okay, and I'm really sorry, I do apologize about that.
No, it's the connection.
Okay, I will repeat what I was just beginning to talk about. I have said that most news organizations, when reporting the European Union, produce coverage which is not aimed at Europeans, but at French, Dutch, Greeks, and other national citizens. The subtext is always what is the European Union doing for and to us. And journalists who find themselves assigned to cover the European Union or Europe thus do what it seems naturally. They bring the nation with them. Whether this is good or useful for their public, it could be something that we could further discuss. Now, most journalism from Brussels covers the central institutions of the European Union, with both eyes on the business of determining how far they act in or against the interests of their home country. This is the case for most media. However, I could say that correspondents who are actually based in Brussels have the opportunity to better understand the complexity of how institutions operate, and most importantly, of the actual policies and decisions being taken or agreed. As you can imagine, reporting from Brussels gives also the opportunity to reporters to better understand the countries that are on their focus. That has been the case, for instance, during the financial crisis. And even they had the chance to travel more to European capitals. And sometimes these travels, I have to tell you, that are being funded by the European Union institutions. They give them the opportunity to go to countries that are on the focus of the European Union at that moment, to better understand the countries and the difficulties probably of national governments to take some decisions. That has been also the case during the debt crisis. And this is really important, as you can imagine, and because if you only focus on the national interests or national audiences, you miss much of the story. So, for instance, during the financial crisis, many German journalists were visiting Athens, and that was the best thing to do, because there were many myths created about how Greece and its public sector was functioning, and that gave the German journalists the opportunity to better understand how the state worked and functioned, and why was it difficult for certain governments or certain ministers to take the decisions that have been taken throughout the crisis. Now, as you can imagine, correspondents in Brussels, and as I have mentioned, have better access to sources than their colleagues working from the capitals of EU member states. They have better access to off-the-record info and better understanding of complex terms, because they have better access to EU people, to people who are using these terms. And this is not the case, and it's not easy. I don't say that it's that journalists working in their back home are not able to reach these people, but it's much more difficult. I mean, when you need to reach a spokesperson, you would not ask him for complex terms. You would like to ask him for other things. So correspondents in Brussels have better access to sources and everything related to their job. Even though technology and working through the web has enabled journalists to cover the European Union from home, the outcome of their work is always far behind than of their colleagues in Brussels. And the real challenge here, that of conveying something of its reality and importance for good or ill to a wider audience, remains partially met, as you can imagine. But only when journalists have completed knowledge of what is actually being decided can only hold the European Union, its institutions, and even the national governments much more to account. Now, having said that, it is quite clear that the media organizations in the European Union member states, and most importantly, I could add here, of the aspiring EU candidate countries, of the EU candidate countries like Albania, need to invest more on having correspondents in Brussels. And because this is not the case, at least now and in the last couple of years, the crisis, the financial crisis, had huge effects, even on the media sector. And I'm not only talking about Greece, even other EU member states, media organizations from other EU member states do not have the number of correspondents they used to in the past. However, it is crucial to have correspondents in Brussels, not only because reporters in the Belgian capital have all the above mentioned advantages in reaching out sources, or getting a rather balanced and better stories than the colleagues in the capitals, but also because in this way they will also avoid spinning their national government's positions and mostly interests. On its behalf, the EU, which is clearly investing, and we have seen the costs a lot in how to communicate itself to EU and also non-EU member states, needs to engage more the media in the main EU institutions and policies, and allowing more constructive criticism on behalf of journalists instead of accusing them, as I have mentioned, of promoting skepticism just because they are being critical on certain decisions or certain agreements being taken at an EU level. Lastly, EU member states, and especially EU candidate countries like Albania, need to invest more on understanding the EU. The lack of comprehension of the European Union is one of the clearest arguments for the teaching of current affairs literacy at school and even universities or colleges. To assume that the public, largely ignorant of the main pillars of their public life, can properly orient themselves is increasingly luxury. The European Union, its history and institutions need to be part of this project. I will leave it here, and I'm ready to take your questions, and I hope you find this interesting.
Thank you, Alexandra. It was very informative, and I think that there's a lot of information that is very helpful regarding Brussels landscape, because we know it is complicated because there are a lot of institutions, a lot of spokespersons, and but of course it is very useful for issues related to the enlargement to go directly to the spokesperson, because many times the media, especially the local media, transmits pieces of articles which are not always transmitted in the right way. So they lose, let's say, in the translation, not because of the language, but because of the concepts or the complications of the relations between institutions and member states. And it is a good suggestion that for such issues the journalists, but not only, also researchers, could directly contact these key people. And also in our personal experience in our organization, they are more than willing to reply and to respond. So of course they are busy, but they take their job seriously. They are willing to help and to provide information. So it's a good suggestion, and I like to emphasize it. Now the floor is open. We will expect. Okay, we have first one of the questions in the chat area, which is in English, so no need to translate it. You can see it in the chat area.
Well, we have a question from Kostian. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. He's asking why the European Commission press conferences receive less attention than the White House press briefing, which is often in the center of attention, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. He's asking whether I think that the spectacle that is created by the clashes that often happens between the journalists and the White House press secretary plays a role in this. For example, when press secretary of the White House during Trump presidency was Sean Spicer, the media coverage was extraordinary. This is a very good question. Thank you. I'm not very familiar of White House. Excuse me. I'm not very familiar with the White House press briefings. I have only covered the midday briefings at the European Commission. However, I can imagine why there is much more interest at the White House press conferences and the daily briefings at the White House, not only during the Trump era, when Sean Spicer used to be a spokesperson, just because it's the personality of President Trump that makes journalists looking for news stories there and asking hard questions. It seems easy, but it's not always easy, I imagine, because I'm not following the briefings at the White House. And the problem is that, as I've said, there is no interest at the European Commission for the European Commission's midday briefings, the on-the-record briefings, because, as I've mentioned, they are very technical. Spokespersons are using technical language, and this is not interesting at all for journalists. They're asking questions, and most of the time they do not take the answer that they are looking for. Imagine, especially TV reporters who want to have a quote for a specific issue. Sometimes they don't get it from on-the-record briefings. However, the off-the-record briefings from the European Commission spokesperson, as I've mentioned, is much more interesting because there the language is less formal and they can ask whatever they want. But yes, it's an interesting question. It's all about, I think, comparing the two is not, we shouldn't compare the two. And I think that I'm now given this opportunity. I think they're doing a very exceptional work there, our American colleagues, while covering the very challenging Trump presidency, and especially that they have to deal with people like Sean Spicer.
Alexandra, I have one question. You mentioned a lot of media at the European level, which are which cover, of course, European issues, but also the Western Balkans. I was interested in your opinion about not very well-known medias, but which are powerful, like the Russian Today or like Al Jazeera, which are completely, let's say, different from the European medias. And I don't know if you have followed them, or what is your opinion on the coverage that they do on the European Union issues. Of course, the Russian Today, it's Russia Today, it's more involved. They have an interest on European issues, like while Al Jazeera, I don't think that they have the same interest, like as a policy, let's say, of the state behind.
Well, thank you for your question. To be honest, I don't follow on a daily basis, neither Russia Today, because, and not also Al Jazeera, because they have a specific perspective, especially in Russia Today, regarding EU affairs. There are also, it's not a matter of trust, but I don't find it useful as a source, my kind of source, while trying to understand what is going on in the EU or in the world. They have their own perspective, which is actually the case for even some national media. They're trying to understand and convey and understand and transmit news related to the EU through their own lenses. that is why I prefer to use transnational media as a source to understand an issue related to the European Union. I mean, I do tend to read some German papers. I also follow Deutsche Welle network. Actually, it has many languages as well, which are national broadcasters, but because I trust them more. For Russia today, there is also a matter of trust on how and what sort of issues they're dealing with. Al Jazeera, to be honest, sometimes I follow how they report issues regarding my country, Greece, and most of the times I have to tell you, and this is completely my personal opinion, are very exaggerated. I don't know whether they're doing it just for clicks or for better viewing, but for instance, regarding our latest, the latest escalation between Greece and Turkey, their reports had been very exaggerated. That is why I do not use neither Russia Today nor Al Jazeera as my source. I don't advise anyone to not to follow this medium, but I'm just explaining to you why I do not follow them on a daily basis, and they're not centrally a media source, at least for me.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we have another question in the chat in English.
Yes, a question from Alba Nicola. The question is, how do you see the media approach of the Balkan countries with the way they cover the news, how independent and transparent they look, how interested they are in transmitting the developments of the issues addressed by the European Union? This is also an interesting question, and thank you. This is a tricky question, to be honest, on the part of whether they're independent and transparent when they cover Balkan countries. It depends. It depends on the medium. It depends on the country it comes from. I mean, if there is a medium from Germany, they usually are more independent, and they have a very qualitative kind of journalism. And usually when German media are focusing on the Balkans, have very balanced way to report on the problems, on the positive news coming from the Balkans. I think all the EU countries, the German media have the best approach. The problem is that, and thank you for the question, I'll try to answer it. The problem is that the European media, especially coming from countries like France or other southern countries who are not much affiliated with the Balkans, are not really interested in this region, and sometimes they are being trapped by the way their national governments approach issues related to the Balkans. So this is something that I have also mentioned in my other speech and within this program, that journalists, foreign journalists, need to travel more and need to get to know the countries that they are actually reporting on. And this is not just for the sake of the travel. I mean, these travels are really useful, and especially for the Balkans, I think that most media reports in the European press are not well balanced, and because the main reason is that they are following the approach of their national governments. And I have explained the previous time how the Greek media also approach most of the times the Balkan countries. Most of the times reflect how national governments see and approach issues related to the Balkan countries. And I hope I have replied to you. There is also another question, but it's not translated for some reason, even though I have good English interpretation. It's
Yes.
from Anita Lucy, but I cannot read it. I cannot understand it.
You can go in the English channel. So.
Excuse me, she's mentioning not only fake news, but also at the end, the fast. And whether the European Union has a strategy for this kind of thank you for the question. It sounds a little bit complicated. It is true that online journalism is all about getting the news as fast as possible. But this is not the case only for online journalism. This is the case also for, and it has been for many years, for radio or television. And it's really a very hard task for reporters working for websites, radio and TV to get the news story and actually a good story to broadcast it or write it online in a very accurate, first and foremost, but also fast way. It is also true that journalists working for this kind of media are working with are not only working against time, but they need to also grasp what is really newsy and even include in their stories a very brief news analysis, which is really challenging. Now, regarding the strategy of the European Union regarding this kind of journalism, I don't think they have a clear strategy, but as I've mentioned, at least the press releases that are being given before the midday briefing are having exactly that. What is the news of the day? And it's really a useful tool, especially for this media, for reporters covering the briefing for radio, online websites, and TV. Now, regarding fake news, I think there is a whole strategy. And I haven't mentioned it, thank you for the question, on behalf of the European Commission. In fact, the last couple of years, it has its own agencies trying to combat disinformation and fake news. It has recruited many journalists in these agencies to work and analyze news, especially coming from specific countries. This is a huge thing about for the European Union, and there had been many concerns just before last year's Euro elections of dealing with fake news and disinformation. not only from non-EU member states, and I cannot name these countries, as you can imagine, but also within the EU. Because one of the main concerns, especially during the last Euro elections, had been Euroscepticism and the rise of extreme right and Eurosceptic parties. So the EU is paying a lot of attention and has specific strategies and specific means in dealing with fake news and disinformation. And I hope I replied your question. There is also another question from Bleda Meta. The question is, if it happened that the EU media are giving the fake news, what is the approach of the institutions responsible for this problem? I just mentioned that the European Union has taken a lot of attention on this issue of the fake news. It's not only a matter of rhetoric, it has its own agencies, it organizes a lot of meetings, it invites journalists from member states to go to Brussels and take part in seminars with experts. It also is, the European Union is also funding special services in EU member states and non-EU member states to combat fake news. I happen to know, because I have made a research about dealing with fake news in some Balkan countries, that in North Macedonia, there are fact-checking services being funded by the European Union. So the Union does not only have a strategy, but it also have its funding ways to combat both disinformation and fake news. And whether there is a punishment for this, what do you mean? If there is any punishment for leaking fake news, or for the media, if there is any punishment? There are specific laws regarding disinformation. Yes, the media give fake news. I'm not familiar with EU laws, to be honest. I haven't seen any media organization being punished by the European Union, by any law, or it has been shut down, for instance, if this is the question. But certainly, if a media organization is being blamed for broadcasting fake news, and I think we have all in mind some specific media organizations that they're usually doing this, they are being punished by the public. I mean, if it's well known that a certain media organization is broadcasting fake news, or it is based on conveys this information, I think the most important thing is that it's getting punished by the public itself. No, I don't know whether there is, I haven't seen any legal, at least if I understand your question, legal punishment by the EU vis-a-vis media organization that it broadcasts fake news. In fact, that is a problem. I mean, I can remember that fake news had not only be today's phenomenon or today's problem. And I can remember, because it's a case that some people in Brussels are using as an example many times for the rise of skepticism in Britain. The example of Boris Johnson being a correspondent for Daily Telegraph and being one of the reporters that have contributed to a large extent to the rise of the Euroscepticism in the UK. So disinformation, fake news against the European Union and its decisions have always been the case. And it's actually a very good question whether there should be a kind of punishment, because however, in a democratic society and democracy that the European Union is, I cannot see any punishment of like shutting down a media organization, even though its reporters are distorting the truth and are against the EU itself.
I don't know if we have any other question. I think no. I mean, we exhausted all the topics discussed. Although there are a lot of other issues, but of course it was very interesting to learn about the media landscape in EU, and of course it's a topic which is very dynamic. It continues to evolve every day, and I like to thank you, Alexandra, on your presentation and your answering of all the questions. It was very useful for us and for the audience that we have today. So it is the last session we are going to have in today's the final event, the concluding event. So I'd like to thank you for closing this series, very successful series of webinars, very informative, and hope to have you again in the future.
I think that the next webinar will be in Tirana, and that I could meet all of you. And as you can imagine, talks are much more easier when you are actually there and you're meeting people and you exchange views and opinions than, of course, the webinars are connecting people, but we should not forget the human contact. It's much more important, at least for journalists. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Atëherë do të vazhdojmë me pjesën tjetër të webinarit, ku kolegja Nirvana Deliu do të prezantoj një temë të rëndësishme, atë të strukturave të negociatave, por pikërisht dhe pjesën ku shoqëria civile do mundet në Shqipëri do mundet të angazhohet në këtë proces, cilat janë instrumentat, cilat janë ato mundësi që janë në dispozicion të në Shqipëri, pra në legjislativit më të fundit, zhvillimeve të fundit që ka pas për aktivit, ku do kemi mundësi që të njihemi me këto zhvillime, por dhe nëse do ketë pyetje apo diskutime, do mundet që ti adresojmë të çështje edhe më në detaje, pasi përpjekur që informacioni të jetë sa më i shkurtër, pikërisht duke ditur për kohën e kufizuar.
Përshëndetje gjithëve, Gledit. Si që Gledisis, të shikojmë strukturën e institucionit procesit Integrimit Europian në negociatave. Sidomos në këto vitet të fundit, kemi krijimin të negociatave të strukturave të reja, kjo dhe në kuadër të faktit që tashmë jemi pra duke zhvilluar, kemi kaluar tashmë në një fazë tjetër, pra hapjen e negociatave, por edhe pra që u bë për ta arritur deri aty. Për të kaluar tek strukturat e krijuar në kuadër të negociatave, mundohen që fillimisht shikojmë një strukturë e cila është krijuar sa vite më parë, pra në vitin 2015, në bazë të ligjit numër 15/2015, të cilën besoj që disa prej jush e njohin në bazë edhe kanë përshënuar apo kanë qenë pjesë të nismave apo aktiviteteve që ky strukturë realizon. Është pikërisht Këshilli Kombëtar për Integrimin Europian, shkurtimi i njihet edhe si KIE. Në fakt cilësohet si struktura më e lartë këshillimore kombëtare kur vjen puna për Integrimin Europian. Ka qenë pra strukturë që është krijuar me qëllimin kryesor që të ketë një qasje sa më gjithëpërfshirëse lidhur me reformat që bëhen në kuadër të procesit të Integrimit Europian, duke pasur si qëllim pra nxitjen dhe garantimin e bashkëpunimit i gjithëpërfshirës, sidomos përfshirjen e shoqërisë civile në gjithë procesin dhe rrugëtimin e europian të vendit tonë. Këshilli Kombëtar për Integrimin Europian ka disa detyrë përgjithësi, janë të listuara duke përfshirë që tek nxitja e bashkëpunimit midis forcave politike dhe shoqërisë civile, gjithashtu sigurimi i diskutimit vazhdueshëm, monitorimi i zbatimit detyrimeve të pra procesin e hapjes së negociatave, analizimi i kuadrit ekzistues normativ, sigurimi i bashkëpunimit të vazhdueshëm për procesin e integrimit mes komisioneve të përhershme parlamentare, duke qenë që Këshilli Kombëtar për Integrimin Europian është një pjesë e kuvendit Parlamentit Shqiptar. Kemi monitorimin e çurisë së procesit të negociatave, këshillon dhe jep opinione pra të termë një këshill, mban kontakt dhe shkëmbën informacion me autoritetet dhe me institucione të tjera të larta të vendit dhe gjithashtu takime me drejtë të grupit negociator. Sipas një test të rregullores së KKJ-s, parashikohet dhe procedura se si të jenë pra përfaqësuesit që të përbëjnë Këshillin Kombëtar të Integrimit Europian. Dhe ky ne parashikon edhe përzgjedhjen e përfaqësuesve të shoqërisë civile. Deri tani janë realizuar vetëm dy shkallje për aplikimin e shoqërisë civile, pra për të marrë pjesë e Këshillit Kombëtar për Integrimin Europian, në shkallën me 6 prej të 2019 dhe një 24 prej të 2019 ku kanë dalë më pas në 7 të 2019. Përfshirja e organizatave të shoqërisë civile në fakt ka pasur një rritje, pra nëse në thirrjen e parë kanë qenë vetëm 8 përfaqësues, në thirrjen e dytë pra për momentalisht kemi 18 përfaqësues të shoqërisë civile pjesë e Këshillit Kombëtar të Integrimit Europian, që nuk kupton që këta përfaqësues marrin pjesë në takimet periodike që KKJ zhvillon, informon mbi një aktivitet KKJ gjithashtu zhvillon duke i përfshirë pra që të jetë pjesë e gjithë aktivitetit të Këshillit Kombëtar për Integrimin Europian. Lista e përfaqësuesve të OSHC-s gjithashtu është transparent, pra është gjendet në faqen e Parlamentit të Shqipërisë. Gjithashtu, në një risi e futur të KKJ-ja është që nuk është vetëm fokusi të përfshijmë aktorët e shoqërisë civile, por edhe të bëjmë të mundur rritjen e aktiviteteve të tyre duke përkushtuar KKJ të filluar më dhe marrjen e disa aktivitete, siç është për shembull një shkollë që bën në kuadër të Integrimit Europian për mund të mësuar përsërisht rritjen e kapaciteteve të aktorëve të OSHC-ve. Ndërkohë, për sa i përket strukturës negociatave, janë disa institucione të cilat do të jenë pjesë e gjithë sa që një strukturë negociatave, e cila sistemi është vendosur të VKM të vitit 2018, në 1949. Objektivat kryesore janë kuptohet e para është të bëhet i mundur procesi screening, shqyrtimi ofrimit legjislacionit të BE-s, përcaktimi e hartimit Republika e Shqipërisë do të mbajë për qëllimi negociuesi vendit tonë secilin kapitull të legjislacionit BE dhe negocimi dhe lidhja e garantit të aderimit. Struktura e negociatave është kjo lista këtu, pra duke filluar me Komitetin Shtetëror për Integrimin Europian, Delegacionin Shtetëror, Misionin e Shqipërisë në Bashkimin Europian, Sekretariati i Integrimit Europian, Grupi negociator, grupe ndërinstitucionale të punës dhe platformat partnerit për Integrimin Europian. Sigurisht është 3 pika të fundit, pra si janë edhe ato mund të jenë më interes dhe janë ato që ofrojnë edhe mundësinë e përfshirjes së shoqërisë civile por edhe të aktorëve të tjerë të interesuar. Grupi negociator në fakt ndihmi nga fundit, pra i realizuar vetëm 6 maj të 2020-s, i cili përcakton si përbërjen rregullat dhe funksionimin e grupit negociator dhe detyrave të kryenegociatorit si pjesë e këtij grupi. Grupi negociator do të jetë realisht përgjegjës për zhvillimin e procesit në teknik të negociatave, pra sipas mos që pak më parë që krijon gjithë strukturën e negociatave. Grupi negociator do të përbëhet nga kryenegociatori, zoti Zek Mazi, dhe nga 18 negociatorët. Kjo është lista e të gjithë negociatori, pra gjithë negociatorëve, nuk kanë gjë tjetër vetë se zëvendës ministra të ministrive përkatëse të cilët do të jenë përgjegjës për kapitujt, për 35 kapitujt pra të legjislacionit të BE-s, të cilat neve do të negociojmë. Siç vjen të re, pjesa më e madhe janë zëvendës ministra. Një ministër ose një ministri mund të ketë më shumë se një kapitull për të negociuar, siç është për shembull rasti i Ministrisë Financave dhe Ekonomisë, siç ka disa kapitull. Dhe nga ana tjetër vjen që kemi edhe 4 kemi profesorë që nuk janë nga ministri, por janë nga institucione të tjera, të cilat këto do të jenë procese për disa nga kapitujt për statut specifik, siç është për shembull rasti i statit, i cili do të jetë kryesore pra negociatat kur vjen puna në kapitullin 13 që kanë fokus statistika. Përgjegjësitë e grupit negociator, siç thamë, pra ka përgjegjësi pikërisht procesin teknik të punës, sidomos të kapitujve, pra procesi të 35 kapitujve, në fakt Shqipëria ka vetëm 33, ku negociohet pra procesi i skringit, legjislacionit dhe negocimit ashtu, hartimi i raporteve dhe takimet gjithashtu ku grupi negociator do të jetë përgjegjës. Unë nuk po i lë të gjitha, juve do ta keni prezantimin dhe më pas antimi ELIAMEP, kështu që për fituar edhe po kaloj tek struktura e tjetër. Kjo është rëndësishme ashtu grupet institucionale të punës, pra tu tashmë janë grupet institucionale të punës për ministrit përkatëse, pra ku do të krijohet ky grup për secilin kapitull. Do të kryesohet nga zëvendës ministri apo profesionistë e institucionit të pavarur, ajo që pam tek grupi negociator. Procesi i grupeve ndërinstitucionale të punës, çfarë do të jenë përgjegjësitë e këtyre grupeve, do të analizojë politika, legjislacionin, procedurat administrative, do të përgatisë vlerësimin analitik të harmonizimit të legjislacionit vendas me IPA II, do të përgatisë propozimin për qëndrimet negociuese për çdo kapitull, do të përgatisë dokumentacionin dhe raportet e rëndësishme, sidomos procesin opening benchmarks dhe closing benchmarks. Do të analizojnë në mënyrë produktive kapacitetet administrative, do të përcaktojnë në konsultime antarë në grupin negociator edhe prioritetet që duhet për vendin antar, që shqiptojnë puna harmonizimin e legjislacionit dhe çdo tjetër që mund dali në këtë drejtim. Ndërkohë, struktura e fundit do shikojmë është platforma e partneritetit për Integrimit Europian. E krijuar me urdhrin e kryeministrit në 30 gusht 2019, numër 113. Qëllimi kryesor i platformës është të rrisë ndërgjegjësimin publik, të shpjegojë ndikimin e procesit të integrimit në vend, të informojë mbi procesin e negociatave por edhe procesin në tërësi, të mbështesë një përfaqësim gjithëpërfshirës të gjithë aktorëve që përfshihen në procesin e integrimit të Shqipërisë dhe të mundsojë aksesin e shoqërisë civile, por edhe të aktorëve të tjerë si biznesi, bota akademike apo grupet të interesit për të marrë pjesë në gjithë fazat e procesit të integrimit Europian. Platforma e partneritetit përbëhet nga bordi drejtues, i cili do ta drejtojë këtë platformë dhe nga 33 tryezat e diskutimit dhe këshillimit. Pra kur do krijohet një tryezë për secilin kapitull të akis. Bordi drejtues do të kryesohet nga kryeministri dhe ka në përbërje të tipit antar. Siç e shikoni, 2 antar do të jenë edhe nga organizatat e shoqërisë civile, 2 nga biznesi, 2 nga shoqatat e punëmarrëse për partnerë sociale, 2 nga bota akademike, përveç profesorëve të tjerë që janë nga institucionet publike. Ndërkohë, për sa i përket tryezave, tryezat do të krijohen pra secila tryezë për secilin kapitull. Qëllimi është që të krijohet një forum bashkëpunimi, diskutimi, konsultimi ndërmjet aktorëve, palëve të interesuar për të marrë pjesë në këto tryeza, për të folur pikërisht për procesin e negociatave për secilin kapitull, dhe është shumë e rëndësishme që në këto tryeza të përfshihen sidomos përfaqësues të organizatave të shoqërisë civile edhe të grupeve të tjera të komunikimit. Bëhen pjesë të gjithë të aktorë që duan të marrin pjesë në një ose në disa prej tryezave që ata kanë ekspertizë apo kanë interes, do të kjo do realizohet duke dorëzuar një letër interesi apo një CV të personit apo të organizatës dhe më pas merret përgjigjja në qoftë se i përzgjedhur apo jo për bërë pjesë e këtyre tryezave. Është rëndësishme është një proces normalisht të ishte realizuar pranë nga ministri për thirrje për çdo kapitull që ata përgjegjëse. Pjesë e ministrisë në fakt e ka përthirrjen për janë mjaftuar vetëm duke bërë ato në faqet e tyre zyrtare dhe duke mos bërë pra një, si të themi, një shpallje më proaktive që të kenë mundësi që të informojnë sa më shumë persona, ndërsa një pjesë tjetër kanë qenë edhe më aktiv dhe thirrja ka qenë më një pjesë e mirë e personat që kanë qenë interesuar janë informuar për këto mundësi për të aplikuar pra për këto tryeza. Për shembull, rasti i EMA-s, EMA është momentalisht pjesë e 2 tryezave të të konsultimit në kuadër të platformës në pjesën e kapitullit 23, e cila kryesohet nga Ministria e Drejtësisë, dhe kapitulli 22, i cili kryesohet nga Ministria për Europën dhe e jashtme. Këto ishin strukturat, normalisht u mundohet të ishin më koncis, përgjithsisht të gjitha urdhrat VKM-t apo informacion më detajuar mund gjeni gjithashtu dhe në internet, faqja e Ministrisë së Punëve gjithashtu është përditësuar, por edhe legislacionet gjenden lehtësisht në momentin që doni të merrni më shumë informacion për secila strukturë. Nëse keni ndonjë koment apo ndonjë paqartësi apo ndonjë pyetje që dëshironi,
atëherë nëse s'ka pyetje, mund ta mbyllim këtu këtë webinar të fundit, duke ju lënë takimin e radhës dhe atë të fundit në datë 30 korrik, pra pas nesër në orën 10. Gjithsesi do ju dërgojmë agjendën e aktivitetit përmbyllës gjatë ditës nesërme, përsëri për të parë programin dhe sigurisht për të regjistruar. Do mundemi që përveç se prezantimeve që do bëjmë gjatë aktivitetit përmbyllës, nisim e certifikatat sipas pjesëmarrjes së pjesëmarrësve pra në këtë seri webinaresh, duke dhe specifikuar webinaret ku keni marrë pjesë. Do kërkojmë dhe bashkëpunimin tuaj për të saktuar më pas të gjithë webinaret ku është marrë pjesë, sepse në disa raste mund ketë pas shkëputje apo mos regjistrim korrekt e emrit, por do t'ju njoftojmë nëpërmjet emailit sipas adresave që keni lënë gjatë regjistrimit. Ju falenderoj për vëmendjen. Miru takofshim të enjten në aktivitetin përmbyllës. Mirupafshim.
Mirupafshim.